there was an article in the paper the next morning, I read it, and it said 15 behavioral health providers had been suspended from the Medicaid program because they had been found through a special audit to be guilty of fraud. And I said, geez, who could those be? I mean, to think that we had fraudulent Medicaid providers in this state. Then we find out in subsequent days that they're talking about the 15 largest Medicaid providers for behavioral health services. And in fact, 90% of all the behavioral health services that were being billed at that time were now determined or alleged to have been fraudulent. This was mind-boggling. And then when I saw the names of the agencies, I knew there was something wrong.
I'm Nancy Jo Archer, and I'm the former CEO of Ogatis, which was taken in a hostile takeover by, as you can see over here, Open Skies. It now covers what was the name of Ogatis. Optum had initiated supposedly a new software system that would develop and review anomalies in payments. Now, we had been informed that they were developing that system, but no one was worried because our assumption was that Optum, who called us partners, would come and talk with us about what the anomalies were. Well, apparently what they did then is turn them over to HSD. HSD then in turn contracted with PCG, the public consulting group.
A group, incidentally, which has become notorious around the country for their lethal audits. They never find anything but fraud when they do an audit.
And subsequent to that audit, called us all in on June 24th, told us that they were holding our Medicaid money and that there would be 3 decisions that they would make. They would either provide technical assistance, they would provide a management team, or they would do what they call a transition, which in my words is a hostile takeover.
They presented us with the report of the audit and basically said that because the failure rate was so egregious, they had turned us all in to the Attorney General's office for criminal investigation of fraud. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Everybody was shocked.
I think clearly this is a case in which there's something wrong with that test. The samples were tampered with. The results were determined ahead of time. You don't have 100% of these long-time mental health providers, these agencies that for years were providing care out of their own pockets in large part because the state was not reimbursing adequately or promptly or in any way fairly. But they kept the programs going through thick and thin for 40 years, and now they've suddenly been ruled to be not just unable to participate in the program, but guilty of fraud. Their reputations are ruined.
We asked the question, well, are we going to see the results of the audit? Because the way we were scheduled is that on that date they would review the results, and then the following day or the following week they would meet with each one of us individually to talk about our individual findings, and we would be able to see what we did wrong, what we failed, what we got. And the general counsel said to the group, absolutely not, because it was such an egregious failure rate. We are canceling those meetings and we will not be reviewing any of the results with any of you because it is now under criminal investigation.
The fact that this audit is not being released to the people in New Mexico is very troubling. What's also troubling is the fact that the governor hired this Boston firm to do this audit when we have a state auditor. If you're truly a democratic government, the governor fully funds the state auditor's office and says, look, these are the problems that we think are going on. We need you to audit these state agencies and then deal with the problem then. Instead, they hire this firm that's notorious.
Now we find out that the real start was back in the fall, back sometime before December of last year, when Arizona companies were approached by the state to see if what What would it take for you to come into New Mexico and take over the operation of our behavioral health providers, in case we had to use you that way? Just suppose that were ever to happen, is apparently what they were told. And about that time, the Assistant Counsel for the Human Services Department, Larry Hayek, published a paper in a law journal explaining how a state could be justified in terminating a behavioral health program based on an audit that alleged fraud. And that Obamacare, somehow the new Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, made it different, that this was somehow a new weapon in the arsenal of the fight against fraud in the Medicaid program. This was orchestrated 6 months before these agencies were notified that they were alleged to be guilty of fraud.
The Affordable Care Act allows states to do this, but it doesn't mandate it in its totality. It allows the providers to appeal the process, so to speak, or for the state and the provider to come up with a reasonable solution. That's what this administration has chosen not to do. In fact, this administration has chosen to hide the facts from the people of New Mexico and to essentially dismantle these 15 nonprofit organizations. These organizations primarily deal with behavioral health. So it's not a nonprofit that has half of its services behavioral health, half something else. So when you withhold funding from these organizations, you essentially dismantle these organizations and crush them.
Long before the agencies were suspected of doing something wrong, all the pieces were in place to end the program. And what I think is curious is that this is all happening leading up to Centennial Care and the new type of managed care that Medicaid will be provided through in the state starting January 1st. None of these 15 agencies will be able to participate in this new method for delivering service. Whatever the Attorney General's investigation ultimately says they were alleged to have been doing and whether they were or not. Their reputations have been ruined. Some of them won't be in existence. They will not be able to participate. And I think that's what it's all about. I think that what the Secretary of the Human Services Department has set out to do, and has so far succeeded, is making sure that the network of providers, community-based providers that have been developed in our state over the last 40 years, that would no longer be even a viable option for Centennial Care managed care organizations to contract with. They'll have to go in a different direction. They can't go this way.
Now, what's lost in doing that is the cultural benefit of having long-standing agencies that have been in their communities, have developed their programs based on the needs of those communities, developed relationships in those communities, and developed an aura of trust in those communities. That is now lost, which affects everyone. It affects the consumer, it affects the staff, and it affects the community that looks at that agency to provide services.
We provide services in a very unique community, Española, New Mexico, Rio Arriba County, in Taos, and individual and in Raton. Individuals who suffer, the children we serve suffer with pretty severe behavioral issues. The families are dysfunctional. The people need a lot of help and attention. And in order to provide that service, for you to be successful in engaging people in treatment, you have to be culturally competent. You have to be able to appreciate the environment in which people live. And the communities are not welcoming to outsiders. And so you have to develop trust. Even for ourselves who, with people from the community who work for us, it took us 3 years to really establish a solid foundation for care in those communities.
I was working as a nurse practitioner in southern New Mexico at the former Southwest Counseling Center, treating adult clients with severe and persistent mental illness. Things were going very well, and our clients were fairly stable. In fact, our statistics had looked increasingly better as time went on until recently when La Frontera came in to take over the organization that I used to work for. I heard one day that the governor was going to suspend Medicaid funding. At first, I didn't take it seriously at all. I thought that, how could this really be true? But it turns out that indeed Medicaid funding stopped and there was a takeover. They came in and took our computers out, and La Frontera moved in, and I can tell you that it turned into total chaos.
I feel that we're not even in the United States. I've never heard of a process where a company can come in, remove the executive director and our chief financial officers, totally do a hostile takeover of our agency without any due process whatsoever. And that's what happened. That's like what's happens in third world countries. That doesn't happen in the United States of America, but it has happened here.
I opted to take the first week of the transition off because it affected the providers as much as it affected the patients. And I was very disturbed, and I felt like I couldn't be therapeutic and able to perform my job the way I needed to do so to help others. During that first week of the transition, though, I had to go down there for administrative purposes. And the day that I approached Southwest Counseling, I saw several of my patients that happened to be the most severely and persistently mentally ill, loitering around outside on the streets. And I was told that they were not getting their medications because the organization that had moved in had failed to apply for a pharmacy license. As it turns out, I did return on the second week of the transition, only to encounter the same type of chaos. There were no operating computers in the building. At this point, the state had done an emergency issuing of a pharmacy license, so the pharmacy was operating at that point, but that was about the only thing that was operating functionally. We had clients that were coming in with old appointments that they had made prior to the transition, and then we had clients that were coming in post-transition, and there was double booking, and nobody could be seen on time because the new company had failed to take into consideration that in order to access the patient's chart, you need a patient's consent. And so it was taking up to 90 minutes for office staff, once they received a consent, to photocopy simply the necessary pieces of the chart that I would need to see these clients. And some of them were waiting 90 minutes to 2 hours, and for a psychotic patient, that's a lot to ask. Personally, this has been very hard. I have worked with some of these clients for 2 years. And all of my clients were stable. They were stable prior to this transition. And for the 2 short weeks that I was there watching this transition play out, each day somebody else was needing to go to the hospital, and they were becoming unstable. Unstable because their situation is unpredictable. Little things like, I don't have a car to take me for a ride today, my doctor didn't show up for work today, my pills weren't delivered today, what will I do now? I worry about what's going to happen to them. I'm very worried about what's going to happen to them.
Transitions posed from above that neglect worker perspectives are often very stressful for employees who feel disempowered, who feel that they don't have a voice into the changes taking place, who often feel caught up in events that they can't control. And this does have an impact on their work morale. It does have an impact on their ability to be the best providers they can be.
Prior to my leaving, there was a lot of fear, apprehension. You know, of course, when you're changing like that in the unknown, I've been there for 37 years, and there's always a reaction when a director leaves. Whether that director was good or bad, when they've been there that long, there's a certain culture that has emanated around that, and that's a major shift. It's a major shift to go to a totally new agency with different values, different processes.
On the day that we found out that we were not getting paid, that our payments had been submitted, that we were identified as potentially criminal frauds, it totally dismantled the entire agency, all of the providers, all of the staff. Everybody was, as you can well imagine, fearful. So many of them report they couldn't sleep at night. They didn't know what they were doing wrong. They didn't know, how was this service delivered inappropriately.
I'm afraid that this latest transition, the introduction of companies from Arizona into New Mexico, will cause greater stress for an already fragile mental health care safety net.
My name is Connie Chavez, and my husband and I are the legal guardians of our 3 grandchildren, 2 of which have been receiving services from what was known as HOGADIS, now known as Open Skies, Behavior Management Services, BMS services. So their diagnosis is reactive attachment disorder, and what that really means is, they have a fear of, they don't trust adults and they don't trust the people in their lives. Even me, who have been close to them for all of their lives, they have a difficult time, and so they need to know all the details, and that plan needs to be stuck to. If there's a change or a shift in that, then it really disrupts their lives, and that creates an escalation. And an escalation can look like, throwing things around, or it can look like kicking holes in the wall, or just shutting down completely. I call it, it's when they go dark. And when they go dark is really when there's been a big disruption in their lives. We are in transition, and last week when HOGADIS closed down, Open Skies opened on Monday, and our service providers contacted us. The school situation is still not resolved. They still do not have BMS services in the school. They're working on negotiating a contract with APS, so that has been disrupted. It continues to be disrupted. Part of their condition is that they don't trust adults, and so when adults come and go, it's difficult for them. And they may never recover from, one in particular, may never recover from a shift in her service provider. They are mainstream girls. They have lots of love and joy in their hearts, and certainly they just have this one issue that they need to be dealing with, and they get those support services which are critical to their success, mostly critical to their academic success. And this disruption and the unknown, it's been a little unnerving. And one day HOGADIS was there, and the next day they were gone, and our lives were turned upside down. We didn't know what was going to happen. I think we still don't know what's going to happen, because doesn't seem to be a streamlined transition. Folks are just doing what they need to be doing, they think they need to be doing, but there's no solid plan. We have not received any communication we didn't receive any communication from HOGADIS. We just received a letter from Open Skies that said basically now they're taking over services, and services will not be disrupted. However, they have been disrupted, and we still don't know. What we were told yesterday was that many of the employees from HOGADIS have left or moved into other positions with the new company, and they're shifting caseloads. And so what that means for us, me in particular and my grandkids, is the potential of having to start over with a new provider. And their condition requires continuity in care, continuity in the people in their lives. So it's still unnerving. I don't know that it'll ever really quite be the same or resolved in the near future. I think it's going to take a long time.
For several years, I've worked with the high-risk population that behavioral health addresses. And I keep thinking about an experience I had when I was the head of the State Juvenile Parole Board for a stretch. And there was a young woman that that really needed a treatment program immediately. And you know, one of these agencies that have been impacted by this audit is Casa de Corazon. And what happened for me the other day when I was organizing something involving Casa de Corazon, I called them up and there was no answer. It was a Friday and there was just no answer of the phone. And I'm telling you, if you're a family member with a child like this, or if you're in the social services trying to help, when you need Casa de Corazon, you need them now. And tell me this, you know, you're in a therapeutic relationship, you're 14 years old, you have, say, physical abuse in your family, you have a drug problem, and you're finally have built up trust with a certain therapist. Suddenly that therapist is gone. They're gone. They're being replaced by people, who knows who these people are, they're from Arizona, whatever. And the notion that our governor would say that there is no disruption in behavioral health services, that everything's going to flow smoothly, is nonsense. And it leads me to believe that, honestly, they don't really understand the nature of the work they're doing.
I received a email from the University of New Mexico LGBTQ Center stating that there was this transgender boy who needed a place to stay. So I discussed this with my partner and we agreed to take him in. It was kind of on a trial basis, see how we all got along and agreed to it and everything. We did that, and when he came to us, he was a pretty resourceful kid. He had already been to the Transgender Resource Center. He had been through a legal service organization, and he was receiving services from Hogares. And we eventually met his caseworker from Hogares. She would come over and she would take him to appointments. She would make sure that he had everything lined up. She helped us make sure that he got his schoolwork done. There was a period where he couldn't go to school for legal reasons, so we had to make sure that his work was getting done. He was 16 years old and he was supposed to graduate that semester. He was going to graduate a year early. So we had to keep him going with the schoolwork, and the caseworker from Hogares was instrumental in helping us do that. And then suddenly things stopped. So he was not able to receive services, and it had been several weeks. He didn't hear from the agency. He didn't know what had happened. Nobody would return a phone call. He couldn't call his caseworker because she couldn't answer. She had a work phone that they made her turn back in. So he no longer had a phone number for her, a cell number, anything. And of course, for confidentiality reasons, she could not contact him in any way. They really had a special bond that unfortunately is broken. There's no way she can approach him now. He's upset that he doesn't know what's going on with his case. He's upset that she's no longer in his life and can't be by law. So it's very frustrating for him. I think he will weather it. I think he will eventually get his apartment, but he's been set back so much by this whole thing.
I have numerous cases, grandmothers who have been calling me, and we just the other day we ran into one of our clients who has a serious substance abuse issue, and he was crying because he didn't have his BMS worker, and that BMS worker was already working for Valle del Sol. We went over to Valle del Sol to the agency to say, when are you going to start seeing him? He needs to see his provider, because some of these kids aren't even allowed back in school unless they have their BMS worker with them. And they're still not ready to provide the services. They don't have forms, they don't have computers, they don't have, all of the things that you have to have in place to provide the service is just not there.
First of all, everyone in the state, nonpartisan, everyone in the legislature takes fraud and abuse incredibly serious. And if somebody's frauding the taxpayers, it has to be dealt with. What's hurting, but it's hurting the clients the way this is done. So it appears that because there's indications of overbilling or fraud in particular agencies, the governor used this and essentially bum rushed the entire behavioral health infrastructure of the state and decides to take it over and give it to this Arizona firm. And so there's more reasonable ways to deal with the problems of abuse and overbilling than just a full-scale takeover of the behavioral health infrastructure. And so it's disappointing that the governor did not look for alternatives, which leads me to believe that there was an ulterior motive in giving these contracts to this Arizona firm. And what that ulterior motive is, I don't know, but it seems obvious that it was that these allegations gave the governor a green light to bum rush the entire infrastructure.
We have been paying Optum Health tens and millions of dollars to manage the behavioral health contract. And they've been silent in all of this. They've never come to do what they're supposed to be doing on their contract, which is to monitor and make sure that there is accountability in the system of care. Where are they? They haven't been around. And now we're turning around and paying these Arizona companies tens and thousands of dollars. I mean, we're paying their airline fares. We're paying them a daily per diem rate, $16,000 for one organization to fly in and out of New Mexico every week to provide technical assistance and set up care. And then the exorbitant salaries that are being paid while they're in this transition period through the end of December of this year is exorbitant. And they're criticizing these New Mexico providers.
I really do think that what it's all about is precisely this, that the four companies that were picked to be the Centennial providers, Presbyterian, Blue Cross, Molina, and United Healthcare, that they were reluctant to accept behavioral health into the package. This is the potential cost overrun item in the whole package. They can control physical health. They know how to do that. Behavioral health is a wild card. And I don't think these 15 agencies were going to play it any way but straight. That is, what I mean by that is, they were not going to be able to be told, stop providing so much service. It's costing us too much money. These were agencies that have a long history of fighting the Medicaid program on behalf of their clientele, of saying, you can't deny service for that, of saying they don't need outpatient counseling, they need at least some inpatient work, of saying you cannot tell us to come back and get reauthorization every 2 days for something that this person is going to need for the next 6 months. They were going to be troublesome. They were going to be problematic for these four big companies. And they would much rather have managed care, behavioral health that they can control. They were going to get it with these 15, so they're gone. And I think that's what it's all about. They said, we'll take behavioral health, but you got to clean out the troublemakers before we take that on. I don't have any proof for that. I don't have a document that says that, but it's just too coincidental that all of this would be coming down just as we enter into Centennial Care. And just when we have to start providing profit for these four big companies in a way that they're uncomfortable with, but the one thing they can get away with is saying no to behavioral health. And here's why. Managed care for physical health is based on the premise that if you provide it early, you'll save yourself money later on. But that's not the way it works with behavioral health, because if you provide the services early on, you're not saving your own controlled managed care budget any money. You're saving money for the jails and the courts and the police and the homeless shelters and the special ed programs in the state. They're outside of your budget. It is true that prevention and early intervention will save money, but not for you if you've got the contract. The reverse of that is if you say, no, we're not going to give those services. I'm sorry you're asking for inpatient care. We'll give you 2 sessions of counseling instead. And that person winds up in a homeless shelter. You're not paying for homeless care. You're saving yourself money at the public's expense. And I think that's where the whole effort at making behavioral health part of that managed care package that these four companies are going to try to make a profit off of, I think that's where it just utterly bogs down and falls apart.
To see this occur without due process, just to wake up one day and to see the behavioral health system in New Mexico totally dismantled, even though it was not a perfect system. Not only is it heartbreaking, it's devastating. It's really devastating to all of us.